tonight's speaker, I have heard Joe Hirsch speak many times, and I've always been both entertained and educated. So it is my pleasure to introduce him tonight. He is currently a doctoral candidate in educational leadership and innovation, and has presented before business conferences and national education conferences. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, Educational Leadership, and is the author of a new book, soon to be a bestseller, called The Feedback Fix, which you can purchase from him at the end of tonight's presentation. Joe specializes in helping organizations break the silo that create friction in the workplace. He's earned accolades from top-ranked business leaders to NFL consultants for his forward-thinking approach. Joe hails from Philadelphia, so we will avoid any football talk tonight. Without further ado.
Thank you. Hi guys, good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me here to spend some time with you this evening. So why don't people change? Why do they resist our efforts to help them? And why is it so hard for us to get what we want by giving others what they need? Those are some of the very difficult questions that I've been exploring over the last 15 months or so, and that led me to complete that journey in the Feedback Fix, which I released just a few weeks ago. We all know that change is hard. It's brutal even. But here's the thing, after going through the research, talking to top leaders in management, learning, and talent industries, listening to other people's stories, I've come to a slightly different conclusion. And that is that people don't fear change. They fear being changed. Or to be more precise about it, they fear the change they can't control. We have a word for that. Do you know what that is? It's called feedback. All of you have given it, most of you have received it, and all of you, I'm pretty sure, don't like it. And it's for a pretty simple reason. Feedback describes a past we can't change, not a future that we can. We can't repair the past. We can absolutely fix the future. So here's the thing. When we talk about moving from past to prologue, from going from back in time into forward time, then we start to unleash the power that everyone has around them. And that's what this book is about giving people the ability to take control over their lives and to give them the opportunity to shape a future that they didn't know they might enjoy. Whether that's in the boardroom or the classroom, the dining room, or even around a mediator's table, this book gives people the opportunity to have a forward-looking approach about their own performance and potential, to stop thinking about who they are and start thinking about who they are becoming. Instead of talking about feedback, tonight I'd like to spend a little time talking to you about feed forward. And I call it that because it looks forward, not back. It looks at a potential and a future that we can still change, not a past that we can't. Feed forward isn't just some theory. Even though I'm a doctoral student and I love theory, it actually works in the real world. It unleashes people's capacity to be more creative. It helps them develop a capacity to be more self-aware. It allows them to work more cooperatively in their teams. It helps them build resilience and self-confidence. It does all of these things and even more. And tonight, we'll look at why feed forward is not just a business objective, but a people objective. Unless we fix our feedback, it's going to stay broken. And that's why tonight, I hope that we can look at getting better in our communication, getting better results, and ultimately helping people become the versions of themselves that they ought to be and may not have ever thought that they could. So let's dig in a little bit this evening and start talking about ways that we can actually help people begin this journey and get better. What I'd like to do tonight is open a conversation with you about how people can start to develop feed forward in 6 different areas, to look at 6 different strategies that people can develop right away, whether it's in work or in life. And for them, using an evidence-based, theory-based and practice-based, to start moving the conversation out of the past and into the future, where change is still possible. So let's start to take a look at the first issue that most people really seem to struggle with when it comes to feedback, and that is that they seem to think that their minds somehow aren't working when they receive feedback. And the truth is, if you think you've lost your mind, it's probably because you have. There's a lot of neuroscience that supports the idea that when people receive negative feedback, their brains actually start to go dark. Neurotransmitters in the brain that convey signals controlling our executive functioning are actually shut down whenever we receive negative news. So this is a picture of a normal person's brain in a relaxed state. You can notice how all the areas here are lit up. They're thinking about maybe the exciting things that happened to them earlier that day. And then they go for a performance review where they go home and they're sitting around the dining room table, and all of a sudden they hear some bad news. They didn't do what they were supposed to do at work. They bungled an assignment. They didn't take out the trash. And all of a sudden, their neural pathways start to flood with stress-inducing hormones that turn their brains into this. All of a sudden, the brain is flooded with stress-inducing toxins that literally shut down executive functioning and make it virtually impossible for us to actually think clearly. And if there's one reason why people don't like giving or receiving feedback, it's because it actually shuts other people down. It takes away their control. And so the biggest problem with feedback, and the biggest reason we need to start adopting feed forward, is because we don't want to shut down people when we talk to them. We want to help them become the best versions of themselves. And so to avoid this kind of mental paralysis, we have to start moving away from that and moving towards a different view. Do you remember maybe back in the 90s when the government had that anti-drug campaign, "This is your brain"? This is your brain on drugs. So if this is your brain on feedback, then we need to look at what people's brains might look like with feed forward. From those campaigns, by the way, I learned one very important thing about drugs. That is never to have scrambled eggs. Yeah, still happen to this day. So when we start to move people out of the victim column and into the creator column, we start to take away that shutdown impulse and help them regain control. You know, there's something called learned helplessness, which is a condition that affects people whenever they seem to feel like they're losing control of the situation around them. When they feel like they've lost control over what it is they can do or be, when they enter a debilitating state of mind, that is when we take away that control. So to move them out of a state of learned helplessness and into a state of control, then we start to move the conversation out of the past and into the future. But that's just the neural case. I want to move this into much more of an everyday people case. And how do we get people to start thinking about themselves differently? Not just what's going on in the internal architecture of their brain, but what happens in the real world, in our teams, in our relationships, when we start to move from past to prologue, when we start to give people the control that they have over their lives, when we move away from feedback and move towards feed forward. Pixar is one of the most successful companies today. And they do something great. They don't shut people down, they amplify them. With a record $500 million in gross receipts for the last 8 films and 20 Academy Awards, Pixar is one of everyone's favorite Hollywood studios and really a successful company at that. One of the things that Pixar does extremely well is they don't just shut down ideas as they come, but they actually unleash them, not quite using something called feed forward, but something very close. So when you think about animated movies, it seems cute, but it's anything but child's play. Who here has seen Monsters, Inc.? Okay, definitely one of my kids' favorites. Who here actually counted the over 2.3 million furry hairs on Sully? It's an amazing feat, and even one small change, one small detour in Sully's architecture changes everything. Or how about Toy Story? What it takes to get Buzz Lightyear from something like this to something like this. It's not easy. In fact, it's a complex progress that people at Pixar call plussing. Plussing works something like this. When design is going on at the studio and the production cycle starts to move from just animation down to the actual formation of 3D images, then what you start to see something called plussing. So any small change in any character's design, a tweak in the lighting, a shift in maybe its movements can create a huge shift down the chain. And when that happens, there's lots of backtracking that has to occur. So all the engineers and all the designers of Pixar come together in these things called crit sessions, which stands for critique, but really it's anything but. And at the critique sessions, these crit sessions, they do the plussing process. Instead of simply saying, you know what, that's a terrible idea, let's go back to the drawing board, they begin in a process that actually borrows a lot from the world of improv. Now, how many of you here have seen anything out of SNL recently? Some of the recent sketches? Okay. So a lot of the cast of SNL hails from a place called Second City in Chicago, which I visited recently, did some work there. Second City in Chicago is an unbelievable place because they know that in the world of improv, it's not just about comedic effect, it's about relationship building. Because in the world of improv, it's about, I've got your back. Now, I'm not gonna make anyone do improv here tonight, but if that were the case, you and I engaging in an active improv would have each other's backs. Not to let the sketch die on the threshing floor, but to actually help keep it going by trying to find ways to keep the idea count rising up, not down. This is what plussing is. Rather than look at, let's say, a sketch of Woody from Toy Story and say, yeah, it's really not working, we have to go back and do it again. The animation designer might say something like this: I like what you did. What if Woody's eyes rolled left? And those two magic words, what if, change the entire sequence of thinking. That relationship is now completely transformed from one of control to one of collaboration. And so in this process of plussing, of moving the idea count up, not down, by thinking about future tense, not past tense, the designers at Pixar were able to move all of those potential snags out of the way and eventually lead to the amazing creations that we've all come to love and enjoy. Now, if we think about how Pixar actually does this, we might divide the two ways of interacting with people into categories: silencers and amplifiers. And the difference between them is dramatic and stark, as you can see. Amplifiers raise the idea count up, silencers shut it down. Amplifiers leave the door open, silencers shut and close. And this is the amazing thing about what they do. Because the power of what if, of yes and, that's something that keeps people in the game, that keeps ideas alive, that doesn't shut things down, keeps them going. And when we're giving feedback to other people, the worst thing we can do is to shut it down, because at that point, the conversation, the plan of action, the next steps, they go nowhere. It freezes right there. But when we start to plus, when we start to think in future tense, what if? Yes, and what about that? Well, maybe this, the feedback conversation completely changes. It's completely redesigned. There's some really interesting research about this as well. I was recently in San Francisco, home of some of the worst traffic in the United States. In fact, it adds, on average, 6 days of commuting time due to lost time on the road. It's horrible. And there are people who actually measured this thing. It's not even the worst city, by the way. Number 1, any guesses?
New York.
LA.
Los Angeles. Number 1 in the world?
Tokyo.
London.
Mexico City. So stay north of the border. Ladies and gentlemen, when they put together a group of people trying to figure out different patterns, how to solve patterns of traffic congestion in the Bay Area, they divided them into 2 groups. One group was instructed to do the traditional form of brainstorming, where people traditionally politely agree with the idea that was just shared and kind of keep their real senses to themselves. And the other group, kind of the bare knuckle brawlers, they were the ones who were allowed to let it rip. So if one group had the white gloves on, the other group had the gloves off. So let's call them the debaters. Those are the guys with gloves off, no holds barred debate. And then the brainstormers, the people who typically do what we do when we're in group sessions or maybe mediations, try to find polite ways to engage the other person. Well, do you know what happened? It's fascinating. Not only did the debaters, the guys, bare knuckle brawlers, come up with 75% more ideas than the other group, they also, once disbanded, continued to produce ideas for how to solve these traffic patterns. Obviously, none of which were successful, because if you've been to San Francisco, they still suffer from congestion. But the point is that these people here weren't content to just simply discuss politely different things that were on their minds, but to really push the envelope, challenge one another with structured debate. And if you want to create a healthier, more robust, and ultimately more productive conversation, having polite brainstorming sessions may not be the way to go. Structured debate might. So the first real-world application here is when it comes to moving the idea count up, not down. Structured debate, like the guys in the Bay City congestion experiment, or the group at Pixar. Show us how to move ideas forward and not keep them stuck in reverse. The next idea that I want to talk to you about is how not to hold people back. And the truth is, even when we don't actually hear the kind of news we like, doesn't mean that we should all of a sudden start presenting all the different kinds of possibilities to other people. Okay, so let's imagine you're on the other side of a review, you're the one giving it, and you see someone absolutely underperforming at work. Nothing's going well. It's just not turning out the way you want it to be. Well, under a microscope, you could probably point out a dozen flaws in another person. And our tendency is to turn the information spigot on high because, as we know, people can't change what they can't control, and they certainly can't change what they don't know. So our tendency is to let loose and to give all that information, all that feedback, good or bad, over to the other person. The truth is that might not be the right thing to do. Feed forward is based on the idea that we exercise a form of restraint, that we not give everything over at once, but that we actually hold back, allow for greater clarity, perspective taking, and ultimately fewer decisions. Because if there's anything that people don't like, it's having to make decisions. Decisions are one of the most paralyzing choices that people face in their day. And the more they do it, the more they experience something called decision fatigue, which is a real thing. And I'm not just talking about beef or broccoli or General Chow. I'm talking about the kinds of decisions that really crush a person, that make it difficult to function in the world. And the more we overload people with choices, well, you're really not completing your expense report correctly. So do you want to do it this way or this way? Or maybe you want to be filling them out on Mondays or maybe on Tuesdays, or maybe the best thing is to have you work with Sally, or maybe it's Jim. Their brain starts to go crazy because they just can't figure out what's the best way to proceed. Now, decision fatigue is a real thing, and actually had some very significant consequences, not just at work, but for people who are facing incarceration. A very famous study a few years ago among Israeli judges showed that among a panel of parole officers in the Israeli judicial system who had, I think, a combined average of 22 years on the bench, so not rookies, there was a strange pattern that developed when researchers started going through about 1,100 cases for parole that they had seen. Strangely, 70% of the time, people were given parole up for parole when cases were heard in the morning, and yet only 10% of individual cases were actually paroled in the afternoon. Strange. It's something in the water. What they came up with was that it actually just happened to be nothing other than decision fatigue. These judges were simply flat out tired of making decisions. They simply couldn't decide anymore. And when they're faced, like anyone, with an insurmountable number of choices and possibilities, they do what anyone else does. They opt for the path of least resistance, which in the case of a parole officer would be to deny parole. And so if you are an inmate, you want your case to be heard in the morning, not in the evening. But beyond that, if you're a manager or if you're working with someone in a mediation, the worst thing that any of us can do is to present multiple choices, the kind that literally shut things down. In the world of educational consulting, we call this restrictive choice. We don't want teachers looking to grow or managers looking to grow their teams to offer innumerable choices, unending possibilities. We want to shrink that change a little bit, as Dan and Heath Chip say in their wonderful book, Switch. We want to actually keep the possibilities for change robust, but limited. And that's something that Feed Forward does extremely well. It presents forward-thinking options for the future, but at the same time, keeping those options at a minimum at a time. So you're not going to be facing someone with 4 or 5 different possibilities. You're going to be presenting 1 or 2, letting them help chart the course, and ultimately decide their fate. We'll get to that more in just a little bit. So far, what have we learned? Number 1, when you offer negative feedback, it shuts the brain down, which is why traditional feedback fails, because it focuses on the past that people can't change, not a future that they can. We can't change the past, we can't do anything with that negative information, and it leaves our neural pathways completely impaired. Number 2, we want to keep the idea count growing up, not down. We want people to start thinking about ways that they can increase possibilities, not limit them. That's what Pixar did. That's the people in the Bay City did. And here, we also know that it's important for people to be precise, to be particular with their feedback, not to give too much at once, just to give enough for people to have the opportunity to be able to make informed choices, but not unending possibilities. The thing is that even if we do get bad news, we shouldn't necessarily be inclined to write it off. And that's what most of us tend to feel. We don't like getting negative feedback. We'd much rather be told how wonderful we are, how we're doing a great job, how we're making the cut and making our case. But I'd like to argue tonight that maybe negative feedback isn't so bad after all. It might actually be a good thing for us. So don't necessarily be so quick to say no to negative feedback. Zenger Folkman, top leadership management firm, has surveyed recently over 1,000 managers, and when asking them about the kind of patterns they notice among their reports, they said that over 70% actually favored getting negative feedback, not positive feedback. Now, some of this, some of this actually has to do with the difference in terms of who people are and where they are in their career. So let's say you're an expert, you're a veteran worker, you've been around the block. You actually like hearing negative news because it helps you improve, it helps you do better work. If you're a novice just starting out, well, you might need a little more affirmation. You might need a little more of a pat on the back. And so for them, positive feedback might be not only encouraging, but necessary. So knowing who you're talking to is certainly a part of it, but even novices reported feeling charged up and feeling the effects, positive effects of a negative review. And so that doesn't mean, again, dumping on people. Being selective in particular is important. Keeping the idea count going up, not down, is important. Giving people control over the process, critical. But negative feedback is also part of Feed Forward. Being authentic is giving the kind of feedback that is real and that will lead to real change. If we hold back and sugarcoat and wrap in Teflon and try to tell people things in euphemisms and mask them and wrap them in these very convoluted constructs that we make up every day, well, then we're not really helping them. Ultimately, telling people what they need to hear is critical. That's why we give feedback in the first place. And so one of the key elements of Feed Forward is being authentic. And if that means being negative, so be it. Don't break the person while you're doing it, but negative feedback can have a tremendous and positive upside as well. So don't be too quick just to say no to a negative review. It's something that we may have to hear a little bit more than we think. There was a group of researchers that actually tried to study this in a university setting. They actually looked at students in an advanced placement French literature class. Okay, so these are students who were on their way, college bound, in high school at the time, taking college level courses, advanced placement material. And these were top performing students, experts if you will. And what these students found is that they would much rather have a professor who is a little bit rougher on them, a little more brusque, a little more difficult to deal with, than the professor that actually sugarcoats and just offers the occasional pat on the back. They prefer to hear the negative feedback that pushes their performance forward, rather than the sugar-coated euphemisms that actually tend to hold them back. It wasn't just in a school setting. Researchers also found that this applied in the world of nail care as well. $1 billion industry. So individuals who rated themselves as nail care experts, people who went for manicures all the time or spent a lot of money on nail care products, were the ones who were more likely to listen to the negative reviews about that shade of red or maybe the wrong hair coloring, and to actually spend more money to go to a better salon or get better services or change their products than the ones who really didn't. Again, the negative feedback was the impetus to push them towards a better future. And so negative feedback might not be so terrible after all. It might actually be the crux that actually gets people thinking in a positive way. One other really interesting case study that came up happened not only when it came to the actual verbal feedback that we communicate, but in nonverbal communication as well. Researchers at Columbia Business School studied the effects of new grads who were asked to give a speech about their dream job. If you could be anything in the world, what would it be? And these students came up one by one, maybe in a room like this in front of people such as yourselves, and delivered their speech and got real-time feedback, nods and approving head shakes for doing a good job, and maybe scowls and frowns, and right, checking their phones from the people who really weren't so engaged. So they got the real-time feedback through nonverbal cues, but didn't stop there. When it was over, they took out a box of art supplies and they gave it to the students, and they said, okay, what I'd like you to do now is create something artistic. And the same panel of judges that just rated you on your speeches are now going to rate you on your creativity, originality, and creative swirl, if you will, for what you're going to be presenting out of this assorted box of crafts. And what was really surprising is that the students who actually received more negative feedback before and who rated themselves worse in a self-report right after receiving all that negative nonverbal feedback actually ended up producing more artistic, more colorful, more original products than the ones who didn't. It seemed that those who received negative feedback used disappointment as a catalyst for determination and creativity. And so negative feedback might not be so terrible after all. Don't necessarily hold that back when you're in a mediation, when you're dealing with a difficult client, when you're facing someone who may not be able to handle negative news. Think about the benefits that might happen, the creative pathways that might be opened, the new ways of thinking that might be charted if they just hear the very authentic and possibly negative news that they really do need to hear. Well, if we're supposed to say thank you for negative feedback, then I think we need to say hello to getting constructive and sometimes combustive feedback from the people we work with. And here's where feed forward is so critically important and where it has such an incredible impact. When feed forward is applied in teams, it does amazing things. It actually helps people work better together. And it's not just because they're building trust and having these open and authentic conversations or pushing ideas up and not sweeping them down. It's actually due to something called creative abrasion. And so one company that did this really well was Nest, now part of Alphabet, formerly Google. What Nest did that no one else had ever done before was create the world's first smart thermostat. Now, thermostats are humble things. There's one over there. It's ugly, it's boxy, it sits awkwardly between the light switch and maybe some artwork that's on the wall. Thermostats don't get a lot of attention, but not to Tony Fadell, who helped design the iPod. Fadell started Nest with just 11 employees in a garage in Palo Alto, cliche, I know, and turned Nest into a veritable powerhouse by creating the world's first learning thermostat that adapted to its homeowners' needs in real time. And one of the amazing things about Nest, besides the fact that it totally broke open a whole new way of thinking about the smart home environment, was that it relied on something called creative abrasion, or the kind of creative possibilities that happen when ideas collide and converge. You see, if you're creating a smart thermostat, you know what you do? You assemble a team of engineers because it's an engineering problem and it needs to be solved with an engineering solution. That's not what Nest did. What Nest did is they took algorithm experts and marketing executives and product managers and pretty much anyone who never took physics in their lives and put them all together with the engineers. And what happened was nothing short of remarkable. The back and forth, the clashing often of ideas, the bringing together of different possibilities created a seamless product line that looked at development from start to finish and enabled the engineers at Nest to not only design something that worked well, but that people loved and wanted to buy and put in their homes and then tell their friends about. And so this integrated approach, one that brought lots of different people together, is yet another boon of Feed Forward, because what Nest did and what every other team who is successful does is they rely on the genius that resides within the team, within the organization, and rather than silo those knowledge sources, they bring them together. They unleash the talent that exists within, and they bring people together in a way that allows them to bring out their creative best and put everything together rather than fragmenting it along the way. Now, traditional feedback, as we're starting to see and starting to understand, is really just about control. It's about a past that we can't change, not a future that we can. in traditional feedback, it's a hierarchy. Only one side can prevail. One person talks, the other person listens. One person leads, the other person follows. One person wins, one person loses. Not with Feed Forward. Feed Forward breaks that model by moving from power to equality, and by creating a collaboration between two individuals. There is always still one person on the giving side and someone on the receiving side. And there probably still is a manager and a report, a parent and a child, a teacher and a student. But instead of viewing that relationship as one of power and hierarchy and control, it's one of consensus and collaboration and community. How does it work? Well, instead of me telling you how to do it, I might set the course and let you move the needle forward. I might suggest a possibility. You might respond with an alternative. I might open a path. You might blaze the trail. And what happens in a relationship of equals is that there aren't winners and losers. There's winners, because I get what I want by giving the other person what he or she needs. And that's ultimately what feedback is meant to do. Not fix someone, improve someone. Because ultimately, we are the ultimate insiders. We hold tremendous information inside of us. We know what's best for ourselves. Sometimes we just need someone to pull it out of us. Well, if we want this to work, if we want creative abrasion to actually lead to constructive outcomes, not combustive outcomes, there's a few things that we can do, a few strategies that we can put into place right away. Here just are some of them. So the first is know the styles of the people on your team. So let's say you're running a mediation session and you have two very recalcitrant parties, and they have been implacable and intractable. They haven't moved. You've tried everything. At this point, maybe it's time to take a step back and understand the styles of these individuals. What is it about this person, deep down, that is preventing him or her from moving over into the column of agreement? What is it in this person's mind that is stopping him or her from coming to terms with a truth that must be seen and understood? When it comes to teams, it works on just a bit of a bigger scale. I don't want to put my early risers together with my night owls. I don't want to put my procrastinators with my precrastinators. I don't want to put my deliberators with my doers. I want people to work cohesively. They might come from different perspectives. They might bring different strengths and talents to the table, but I need to know those very core principles of who those people are deep down in their architecture that allows them to be who they can be. Because we don't want to change someone, we want to help someone be the source of that change. We want someone to move that needle forward, not to fear change, not to fear being changed, but to be that change. That is ultimately the goal of any feedback interaction. That is the goal of any mediation. That is the goal of all of our communication. Know the styles, number one. Number two, super important to set guidelines ahead of time about how this is going to work. Nest didn't just bring everyone into the room and say, okay, 18 months later, let's have a prototype. There were guidelines in effect that allowed them to work constructively and collaboratively and to unleash that team genius that resided in the room. It gave them the confidence to act and the competence to be who they really were. And finally, maintain goals at the forefront. It's important from the start to have a clear sense of the destination, to know where people are headed, to know where we want to go. If we don't know where we're going, it doesn't really matter where we travel, right? And so having a clear sense of the destination, if that's getting someone to yes, we'll get back to Bill Urey at the end. If it's a question of getting a student to do something that he or she isn't willing to do, if it's helping your spouse put that dirty laundry away that's been sitting on the floor for a week, whatever it may be, getting someone to understand the ultimate goal starts with us understanding where's the destination. So know the styles, keep the goals in the forefront, know your outcomes. These are some things that can help us bring out the very best in other people, and rather than just siloing all the knowledge sources, strengthen them by bringing them together in a synergy, not a set. Well, we're getting towards the end here, and the truth is that once you've upended all the traditional scales of power and feedback, you're left with really this: a situation where people describe, not prescribe. This is a really effective strategy for feed forward, because ultimately people are their own best knowledge sources. They're the ones who are the ultimate insiders, who have an amazing self-awareness of things that only they and only they know and can do. So in life we have the choice of either looking through a window or holding up a mirror. Looking through a window, I tell you what I see. It's my view, not yours. My view is the one that prevails. This is getting back to power, not equality. But when I hold up a mirror, so holding up a mirror isn't about my view, it's about your view. It's about what you see, not what I see. So looking through the mirror, looking up at a window, is the critical difference between feed forward and traditional feedback, between feed forward that succeeds and feedback that often fails. When we hold the mirror up to another person and describe the problem, or prod them with a challenge, or push them to name that issue that's nagging them, well, we're no longer the source of information. They are. They're the ones who are holding the cards, not us. All we're doing is opening up a new vista for them to see this problem, a new perspective to understand these events. This is where feed forward can be incredibly effective. Because the truth is, what we want in feed forward is to let go just a little bit, to relinquish control and hand that control back to someone else, to put them in the driver's seat. But here's the truth about letting go. Letting go isn't about what we give up. It's about what we give. And when we give people the opportunity to be their own knowledge sources, to think through their own problems, to be that guide on the side, not the sage on the stage, when we do all those things, we give them the opportunity to think more clearly, constructively, and competently than they ever have before. It's not our idea superimposed on their problem. It's their idea, their solution. And that's a critical change that happens each and every time that we make that very deliberate shift from feedback to feed forward. One of the things that happens when we do this is that we increase people's self-awareness, right? Because if I'm always telling you what to do, you tend not to be very self-aware. There's no reason for you to be self-aware because you don't need to think about these problems on a meta level. Someone's doing the thinking for you. Your boss, your teacher, your parent, your spouse, your cousin, the guy in front of you. It's no longer about what you're thinking, it's about what someone else is thinking. But with feed forward, we're putting that thinking back onto the other person for them to start to name the problem on their own. Researchers at UCLA did something really fascinating and I think terrifying. They took a group of people who had spider phobias and actually forced them to walk up to the dreaded arachnid. Now, if I had a fear of spiders, I'd probably completely fall apart. So these people, maybe they were paid a lot for the study, participated in one of three groups. One group was supposed to face that fear head on, name the problem. That is a spider. I am terrified of it. I'm going to keep walking and not move from my course. Then there was another group, the reappraisal people, who tried to convince themselves that this really wasn't a spider, it's an ant. It's just a really big ant, and I'm not afraid of ants, so this is fine, I'll keep going. And a third group, they were the ones who completely ignored the problem and pretended like it wasn't there. I can walk in a straight line just fine, no problem. Well, the researchers found that the people who actually confronted that fear head on, who named the monster, they were the ones who were able to deal much better with the problem and show greater signs of control, fewer signs of reactivity, putting control over their fears, and ultimately taking control of the situation. And that came from them. They named the problem. Well, when we start to put all this together, we come up on a really critical truth that Bill Urey of the Harvard Program for Negotiation said, and that is an idea that I'm sure is known well to all of you in this room, and that in any argument there is not one side, there's not two sides, there's three sides. There's my view, there's your view, and then there's the argument, or how it affects us. And Feed Forward is one of those things that allows us to start to really take control over who we are, more importantly, who we are becoming. It allows us to help people develop a more creative capacity and develop more confidence, more resilience, to work better in teams, to reflect on the kinds of issues that are problems for them that might be turned into solutions. Feed Forward is the critical thing, that invisible hand that separates growth from decline, success from failure, joy from fear. It is the very thing that enables us to be who we are meant to be. So if we are brave enough and bold enough to make that fearless shift from past to prologue, to stop talking about people's problems and start focusing on their strengths, to not view talent as an expense, but an investment, then we can do a world of good. Our relationships will be healthier, our businesses will be hardier, our workplaces will be a whole lot healthier. And that is just a simple tweak, because Feed Forward might have a method, but ultimately it's about a mindset. Do we want to stay in the past, or do we want to march into the future? It really comes down to a simple question: looking to the past or to the future, building silos or opening up circles. What kind of organization do you want? What kind of friendship do you want? What kind of relationship in your home do you want with your children, with your spouses? What do you want it to be like with your friends? How should your classroom operate? These are people issues that we deal with every single day. And if we have the courage and conviction to move away from the broken past and into the fearless future, we will unleash the potential of everyone to become the people that they can be, the people who they didn't think they could become, but ultimately always were deep down, past or future. When we move out of feedback and adopt Feed Forward, we embrace a future that allows us to dump the past and lead our way to change. That's a change that needs to happen right now. It's a change that can happen and starts with each and every one of us in everything we do. Thanks very much for listening tonight. I appreciate it. Okay, and now for your colonoscopy.
Question.
Go ahead, sir.
I buy into everything you said, as a matter of fact. Much of it I could have written your book.
You would have saved me 15 months of agony.
Yeah, but you're going to get paid for it, and I'm not. But the question that I have is, I believe in it. How do you instill in the other party that you may, or parties that you may be dealing with, that they need to buy into it as well?
They got to read the book.
It's an excellent question. I would start by doing what we said earlier about describing, not prescribing. Describe the problem for them. Don't tell them they have a problem. Ask them, so how's it going for you today, right? How's that working for you, right? That issue that they're dealing with you. And they'll come to a pretty quick understanding on their own, if they're reasonable, again, if they're reasonable, that what they're facing is a problem. What you're proposing for them to do is a solution. And ultimately, it comes from them. Again, people don't fear change, they fear being changed. So when I feel subjected to your view, when you're in control of me, I naturally recoil. Because our impulse is to be free. We want to live a free life, and that's in every respect.
If I don't feel like I have a problem, how do you convince me that I should look at other alternatives? I guess what I'm saying is it's a mindset of the individual. I had my father, God rest his soul, was as stubborn as they come, and it didn't really matter what it was you were going to say. He was going to say no, because that's what he was. So you had to learn how to work around him. But to try and convince him of a particular vehicle to make it better for him would be almost impossible. And I know that there are people out there that like that. So how do you go into an organization where you've got middle management who's afraid of losing their jobs and are numbers oriented, that have people that they're responsible for, who have a myriad of personalities and wants and wishes and desires and bias, etc.
Yeah.
And sell the program so that you can get to a point where you can say, tell me what's on your mind. How do you do that?
Last summer, I worked with a group at Deloitte up in Westlake at Deloitte University, and this is a group of individuals very smart, very young, very smart, very talented. What they struggle with is kind of what you're saying. Sometimes they don't even, they're blind to their own blindness.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And so one of the things that the group was able to do, well, was ultimately own it because they got what they want because the company gave them what they needed. When you tell someone, I want to help you solve this problem, or in the case of this group at Deloitte, I want you to be the best performers you can become. What can I do to help make that happen? Start listening. You'd be surprised what people say. There's always what they say, and there's always what some have called the awe question, and what else, right? So they'll start talking, and they'll say, yeah, you know, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. It's not my job. It's not my responsibility. I don't think I have the time for it, and it's way beyond anything that I'm capable of doing, given the time constraints that I'm facing. So when you hear that, there might be something lurking beneath the surface. And that's when you say, so what really is holding you back? And they start talking, because people have that insider knowledge about themselves. There's a whole strand of the book on consciousness and how Feed Forward develops people's ability to really look inside themselves, what I call the inside game. This allows people to bring out and, in fact, cut through all the layers of disagreement and dissonance that separate them from really wanting what you want. You both want, ultimately, for everyone to be productive and happy. We want it for our reports. They want it for themselves. So let's listen a little more to what they have to say. Part of that is what I said earlier about it's not what you give up, it's what you give. So when you give a little bit in the way of control, when you cede some of that authority, you unleash other person's creativity and perspective taking. And sometimes they'll bring out the answers or even identify the problems on their own. Now, I agree with you, sir. They have to be reasonable people. And this won't work if someone is completely shut down. If he's like the brain-dead individual whose neural pathways are flooded with negative cells. But our job, that's a different problem. That's first the psychologist and then the silo breaker. So that's ultimately what will help a lot. Get to a point of reason and then get to a point of listening.
But isn't that the first issue that you've got to overcome? Isn't that the first hurdle to overcome? To get both management or whatever the group is to acknowledge the same thing is true with mediation. You can get one who wants to mediate and another one says it's going to be a waste of time. I don't want to do it. So it's there lies the stumbling point. I don't disagree with what you're saying and how to get it done. All I'm saying is that the assumption there is that everyone that's going to be involved in this is going to go with it. It's going to be a productive session. Well, I would say that there's probably at least 30 to 40% of people who are going to say, it's a waste of my time, I need to be back at my desk and on the telephone.
Yeah, the reason why most people shut down is because and treat these kind of encounters as wastes of time is because they have been conditioned to the cold reality of it. But
how do you address that?
Yeah. So data is helpful. When you show someone there's a real problem, that's one issue, okay? In the world, let's take two realms, an education setting and a business setting. In education, it's a lot easier to work with data. There's lots of different inputs that come in, whether it's information coming from parents or their classmates or other teachers. We see kids in a lot of different contexts. So all that data presents a picture that can then objectively be presented to a person. And sometimes people just aren't ready for that yet, and maybe never. But those aren't the people we're trying to change. Those aren't the people we're trying to help. You can't help someone who doesn't want to help themselves. So there's that. And in the business world, it's a lot easier, perhaps, because they can just be given the door, shown the door. However, that's not what companies want to do. What Deloitte was really interested in doing is increasing engagement and work-life balance among this particular group. And so one of the things they're relying on is a action educational approach. How do you motivate people, which comes out of my world. And so this is an area which is ripe for feed forward, because ultimately, once there's even an acknowledgement of a problem, maybe reluctance to change, but an acknowledgement of the problem, you can work with that. Agreed. Can't change someone who won't be open to the possibility of change or even listening. Yeah.
It's something of a precursor. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure that you've run into it. I'm sure you've seen it.
You can only help someone who wants to help himself.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The road to recovery starts with acknowledging
That there's a problem. Right. First of the 12 steps. Okay.
Any other questions?
So let me ask you a question. How's it going for you? Where are you running into problems in your lives with feedback? Where do you find the issues taking place? Is it an issue, as Joel mentioned, that people just aren't willing to listen? Is it a problem that the kind of feedback you're giving just seems to fall on deaf ears? Maybe there's a willingness, but there's no receptivity. What's going on with you in your worlds? How does this play out for you in a mediation session, for example? Where are you finding the challenges and the difficulties?
Well, one of the challenges that I find is that you have to open the minds of both the client and the attorney on each side. And so sometimes you can connect the client, but not, and of course, they're not looking for fundamental change. They're not looking for this insight. It's the client that is. So you can reach them, but then you have this lawyer sitting there that perhaps owns them, and he feels protected. They're zealously trying to defend their client, but they're causing barriers in communication.
So external obstacles getting in the way. How about on the home front? One of the areas that this book really looks at, besides boardroom and classroom, is dining room. It's a real issue. How do we give feedback to our kids? How do kids give feedback to their parents? How do we have healthier, more constructive communications with one another that actually lets us get what we want by giving others what they need? Anyone still actively raising kids at home? You're like, oh, thank God that's over. Yeah. All right. I can tell you something in my life. I have 4 boys. They kind of run the gamut from here to here. And one of the things that my wife and I have struggled with is, how do we let them be agents of their own change? It's easy for us to tell them what to do. How do we give them the kind of feedback that lets them stand on their own 2 feet and be resilient and autonomous and one day grow into the adults that we hope they'll become? Well, that's a major body of research, and that's a big storyline in the book as well. How do we help people become more resilient? How do we help them think about taking that next leap of faith, stepping outside of who they are and becoming the person they might become? How do you do all that? So that's something that happens all the time in so many homes, everywhere. And it's an area where Feed Forward can make a tremendous impact, because when you're not talking about the past, and you're not relitigating past crimes, and you're not just prescribing fixes, but instead letting others have a voice and express choice, changes the dynamic. It allows them to think about themselves as adults, to be more supportive of their own autonomy.
What if their choices are not the ones that you agree with?
Yeah.
Freedom is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it's true. Well, a helpful strategy is restrictive choices. That is, of course, if you're still able to create those restrictive choices for the kids when they get a little older, you don't have that much say. Aside from just praying really hard and hoping for the best, there's also a few things, and that's relationships. Rules without relationships equals rebellion. Okay? So without a relationship behind a rule, or without rationale behind a directive, it's hard for people to buy in. So there you're not describing it. You're like, no, you will be home by midnight for curfew, right? And so that's not a choice anymore. That's a directive. That's okay. That's a parent's prerogative. Don't misunderstand me. Feed forward is not about relinquishing control and a return to anarchy. Feed forward is about returning some control to people, just enough to allow them to be able to be thinking about their own fate rather than being reactive to someone else's rules. Feed forward is about letting someone think about the person they might become, not telling them who they ought to be. Feed forward is about shaping the path, ultimately letting them make their own travel plans. So that's where I think parents have to have a certain confidence, a certain humility, and also a certain amount of trust that it's going to work out, and that you've done enough until that point to help them make the right kinds of choices. And if it doesn't go well, that you're there for them to support them in the fallout.
Well, to support that, and just to bring it back to mediation, some of the most transformative times I've had is when there's been time to build relationship with a party, and then there's some trust. Even if it just took a day or half a day. And once they have that trust, you can do what you just said, show them some choices or a pathway, let them choose. But now they're relying on your guidance because you build a relationship, whether it's your kids or mediation. I mean, I think that's the key, is the relationship. That's the goal that pays for the two-way street.
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot of Marshall River. He has another term for the nonviolent communication. He says basically, when somebody feels conflict internally, you have four choices. You blame yourself, you blame the other person, you get angry at yourself, and you get angry at the other person. Or you can ask what it is the other person is needing, or ask what you are needing. And when you go to that discussion of needs, you start from what your needs are and what you're missing, then you open the door. Instead of prescribing, as you say, something, you open the door to understand what the other is needing, what you're needing. You can search, you can question if the other person is not willing to listen to your needs. You can also go and ask what their needs are, and start questioning from that.
As you're saying that, I'm even thinking about a person I met here in Dallas not too long ago at the Momentous Institute, which, if you're not familiar, is changing the odds for some of the neediest children in our community by providing educational and therapeutic services to a very underserved population. And I met someone at Momentous recently. Her name was Yolanda Mendoza. And Yolanda grew up in Oaxaca under some very difficult circumstances. She grew up under the specter of toxic stress and abuse. And one of the things that became clear in talking to her and trying to understand her story was that this is a person that faced those choices similar to the ones you're describing. And that triggers, from what we know about the brain, three responses: fight, flight, freeze, right? You either, right, this is your pituitary sending all these signals, right? Your hypothalamus goes into overdrive and you start actually feeling that rush of adrenaline, right, from your adrenal gland that sends you into action. Or, like if you or me encountering a raccoon last night as I took out the trash, you run fast, fast and far, all right? And so that was my signal. Sometimes we go into brain freeze. That was how we started. Sometimes people are left truly in a state of mental paralysis when they get feedback that operates in the past. It just doesn't help anyone. And if we want them to unlock that amazing capacity for creation, to be that person they can be, to think about things in a moment of self-awareness, we can't talk to them in a way that shuts them down. We have to let them come out with those answers themselves. And that's coaxing. There's an art, there's a science, but ultimately it's really about a mindset. do you give someone what they need and yet get what you want?
Mutual respect.
Yeah, rules without relationships equals rebellion. Feedback without some kind of ground game is not going to be very effective. Ultimately, it's about understanding, it's about empathy. Empathy is a big piece. It's about humility, right? Typically, when people operate in a traditional feedback apparatus, it's I'm right naturally because I'm the manager, I'm the parent, I'm the teacher, and you're wrong because you're the underling. I'm all for authority, trust me. As a teacher, I believe that. However, I also think that it's critically important for us to soften our stance sometimes and to try to put ourselves into the other person's shoes, get out of our zone of practice, release ourselves from our view and try to see it from theirs. Because ultimately when that happens, we begin to understand the person just a little better, and in the process, we understand each other.
Joe, I'm thinking, trying to be a little bit of the devil's advocate on a recent issue. United Airlines and Oscar Munoz, the CEO, that when the incident happened, he went and told everybody there was not a problem. The problem was the reallocation, whatever was his word, until the Twitter world basically slapped him silly and he had to sit in front of Congress and whatnot. And finally, oh yeah, I see it. A problem that could have been solved very easy at the beginning, it became very complex and it grew beyond control to anybody. And I'm reflecting and thinking that many times you've got the leadership of companies that will go into the traditional feedback. Gotta do this because we got a quarterly report. We're going to announce this to Wall Street next month, next quarter, and the reactions or the actions are very short-sighted versus a more genteel approach on a feed forward, where you're collaborating, looking for solutions and whatnot. And aside from reflecting, I'm thinking that it's a major challenge in corporate America to make that change, the leap of faith into let's approach it in a different way. From the quarterly reports have to go to the stock market and what have you, and people react. Solve the problem tomorrow, which means get rid of that employee or that situation.
Yeah, short-termism is a major problem in corporations, which is why in the book I try to show the stories of people who are moving from the short-term quarterly report focus to a much more long-term view of performance and potential. These conscious capitalist companies, some of which are part of our everyday lives, Whole Foods, Costco, Gore-Tex, right? These companies are doing well by doing good. And they're adopting a lot of these principles that really are not tremendous novelties, but are just sometimes a little bit beyond the grasp of someone caught up in the wheel of Wall Street and reporting. What they've done well is start to shift that focus away from ratings to people and to start talking about development, not just numbers. And they're still accountable. These are publicly traded companies with shareholders to satisfy. Yet at the same time, they're looking at more than just a shareholder. They're trying to create stakeholders. And when you move from a short-term shareholder focus to a long-term stakeholder focus, which still includes your shareholders, you're able to address some of the issues that perhaps contributed to the demise at United, which I think Munoz said really was initially a systems failure, which is euphemism for we just screwed up royally. But where does something like that happen? How does something like that ever occur? Aside from people being barbaric and not decent, how does something like that ever happen? Well, some of it actually starts with, I think, the short-term outlook. When you're always focusing on, I have to get a result today. You will prescribe, not describe. You don't care about the idea count rising. You want a solution today. You're not interested in holding a mirror. You're looking through a window. And that is the fatal flaw of traditional feedback. It is what's driving companies away from traditional rank and yank methods of reporting, really pioneered in the 80s under Jack Welch, and GE reaching a peak over the last 2 decades. But there is a counter-revolution led by Deloitte. They're profiled pretty significantly in the book. Spent a lot of time with those guys. They are doing things that are remaking performance management completely. And others are taking cues. Microsoft, Juniper, Cargill, Adobe, Medtronic, Gap. These are big companies that have shareholders, that have Wall Street, that have earnings reports to issue and media to confront. And they're doing this. It's a slow but steady revolution, and it's happening. And it starts with a shift from short-term to long-term, not thinking in years but decades. Not how far you can go, but how far you can see. That is what will change the needle on the way companies behave.
One last question. That's you. Pressure's on.
I was curious about, so those changes in those companies, my assumption is that's coming from leadership. I'm in a different situation where I work for a very hierarchical company, and I have all of this wonderful training on all this stuff. And how do you recommend feeding up? I mean, I've walked away from meetings going, that leader needs leadership coaching. That person needs someone, and there just isn't. The system is very set in place. So, do you have examples of changes where it's coming from the other direction?
There's a Fortune 100 consultancy here in Dallas, actually not too far from here, called Stegan Leadership Academy. Rand Stegan is a consultant, some of the most successful CEOs in the country. What Rand told me he does really well is actually sneak in all of this long-termism engagement stuff around a steady diet of executive training. So he'll bring people to the table with his Trojan horse of executive coaching, et cetera, and then slip in beneath the top layer all these strategies of how to be a more conscious leader. Because ultimately, as Rand likes to say, leaders get the companies they deserve. Think about that for a second. That's so true. Think about it in your own lives. Parents get the families they deserve. Teachers get the classrooms they deserve. Leaders get the companies they deserve. This is so true. So short of hiring an outside firm to help you with that, I think you be the source of change. You start. And that war is won on the ground every day. I've seen it take place in several companies, some here, some not. I've seen it in organizations big and small. It really works when people decide to be that source of change and to stand for these principles, that we aren't focused on just cold numbers and being bean counters. We're people builders. We're focused on development. We're focused on bringing out the best in everyone, helping them become the people they could one day be. That changes everything. Be that source of strength and be that leader within your own team, within your own department, and it catches on. Or the company goes bankrupt and there's a change management. So, and that happens too. Thank you guys very, very much. I really appreciate spending time.